Hi, I'm Natalie Bouchard, and you're listening to Inside NC Labor, a podcast designed to inform and educate North Carolina citizens on the role that the Department of Labor plays in state government. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Inside NC Labor podcast. I'm Natalie Bouchard, Public Information Officer with the North Carolina Department of Labor. And today, in accordance with social distancing protocols, we are doing a special podcast over the phone. We're going to be talking about grain safety today with some special guests. We have Beth Rodman with the Agricultural Safety and Health Bureau with the North Carolina Department of Labor, and then we have LaMar Grafft, who is with the North Carolina Agromedicine Institute. So Beth, take it away. Tell us what we need to know about grain safety.
So as Natalie mentioned, I first want to talk a little bit about our special guest, LaMar Grafft with the North Carolina Agromedicine Institute. The Institute is a consortium of universities, which includes East Carolina University, NC State University, and North Carolina A&T University. Dr. Robin Tudor Markham is the director, and LaMar Grafft, who's here with us today, is the associate director. Their partnership is really important to the North Carolina Department of Labor in many ways, but one thing I want to talk about is how our missions align. The Institute's mission is to promote the health and safety of farmers, fishermen, foresters, their workers and their families through research, prevention, intervention, and education and outreach. The North Carolina Department of Labor, specifically the Agricultural Safety and Health Bureau, we are responsible for administering a broad scope of workplace safety and health laws that apply to agricultural employers. We do that by compliance activity and also through outreach and training events throughout the year. So we partner frequently with the Institute, since both of our overall goals is to reduce injury and illnesses for agricultural employers and employees. We are doing this podcast today to support the National Stand Up for Grain Safety Week, which runs from April 13th, 2020 through April 17th, 2020. Our goal with this podcast is to reach employers and employees across the state, and maybe some employers outside of the state who tune in, who work in grain storage and grain handling facilities. So a safety stand-up is a voluntary event for employers to talk directly to workers about safety and health. Any employer can participate in the stand-up by taking a break from their day-to-day activities and set aside some time to talk with workers about hazards found in the workplace, hazard prevention and protection, and the company's safety policies and goals. It's important for companies to remember that this should not be a one-way conversation, but also an opportunity for workers to talk to management and provide direct input about hazards they see every day. Mm-hmm. Communication between management and employees is such an important part of maintaining a safe work environment. So today we are specifically talking about the grain safety stand-up for grain handling and storage facilities. And if they want to participate, they can go to the website, which is www.standupevents.org/grain.
So Beth, what can companies do to participate?
So companies can participate by providing a focused safety activity such as verbal training. They can do toolbox talks, demonstrations, or discussion on topics such as grain bin entry. And if they go to the website, each day of the stand-up, there's going to be a focus on a different hazard. So they can go to the website for ideas or think about their work environment and what topics they want to address during the stand-up. Speaking of grain bin entry, the reason we invited LaMar here today is because he has a lot of experience working in and around grain bins, dealing with the hazards associated with grain bins, and conducting training for responders for grain bin rescue missions. So LaMar, you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I grew up on a farm in eastern Iowa, as most people are aware, is noted for grain, especially corn and soybeans. So there's a lot of grain stored. We had grain bins on our farm. So I do have the history of working in grain bins as a youngster, and also since I farmed until I was 35 as a young adult. So I've done that. I also assisted with the Grain Handling Safety Coalition out of Illinois, which is a large group of industry and farm organizations that do safety programs They developed a training program. I helped with that and helped with some of the initial teaching of it. And Purdue University compiles all of the data of people getting caught in grain bins, and I helped with a program that they developed for grain safety issues. And then since being here in North Carolina, I've been here 6 years, we've done several grain safety programs and grain rescue programs for rescue teams and fire departments.
What are some of the hazards associated with grain bins?
You know, if you're just talking about all of the hazards associated with it, there's certainly the hazard of engulfment, which is what takes most people, getting caught in the grain in one form or another, getting caught in the equipment, falling from the top of grain bins or grain silos, and also electrical situations where some part of the bin might be energized, or even moving augers around the bins that come in contact with power lines that are overhead. If you're talking about the hazards that most people are getting caught in, that would be getting engulfed in grain inside the grain bin. That takes by far the largest number of people. I want to put this into perspective, though. There are about 400 people that are killed in farm injury events across the United States every year, and only about 15 to 20 of those are grain related. So if we're looking just as the total number of people killed, grain is a relatively small proportion of those. About 100 of the 400 are from tractor overturns. So I wanted that to be in perspective.
Absolutely.
But when we talk about people going into grain bins, then the discussion turns as to why people go into the grain bins. And by far the biggest number of people who are caught in grain and die or are near death because of that, are buried under grain or partially buried. They go in usually because the grain is out of condition or spoiled in some fashion. A crust may form on the top. That crust breaks up, starts to go down into the grain, comes down to the bottom where the grain goes into the auger, plugs that auger, and prevents other grain from going in. So they go into it thinking that they can shove something down in there to break up that plug, and if they do that with the discharge auger running, then the grain can very quickly cover them up enough so that they can't get out of it by themselves and pull them on down into the grain.
Wow, that's awful. Wouldn't
that be a horrible way to go? I mean, any way that you're aware of it would be horrible, but
right.
I cannot imagine what that must be like.
No,
well, I kind of can. I've been caught in grain, but
can you speak about that a little bit? Your experience being caught in grain, if you don't mind.
Sure. When I was farming, we've had a lot of cattle, and so we had a need to get grain out of bins on a daily basis. And there were times when the grain would be out of condition. It hadn't been dried enough, or perhaps there was a small leak in the roof of the bin, or condensation from the change in temperatures. Keep in mind, in Iowa, it'll get to 20 below zero in the winter. And then when the sun beats on the south side of the bins, especially even in the winter, it warms up enough to cause moisture to change and accumulate on the top surface of the grain, can cause the grain to go out of condition. So very typically when I was farming, I was not concerned about safety, much like many people take risk into minor consideration when they have to get the job done. And I would do the things necessary to get the grain out. And first, with the auger running, you'd shove the slide in and out, which opens the sump in the middle of the bin. And then If that didn't knock it loose, you would shut it off, open the slide up, go into the grain bin, push a rod down in, hoping that you were in the center of the bin, pull the rod out, come back out, turn the power on, and if it still didn't work, you shoved it back and forth. And I would do that 3 times before I would then go into the grain bin with the discharge auger running, pushing something down into the center of the bin until the grain started to flow. Now, if the grain is dried down to where it's going to keep for the most part, you will be sinking in the grain about to the middle of your calf, just because that's the type of material it is. When the grain starts flowing, at that point, if the grain gets above your knees and is flowing out from under you, you can no longer pull your legs up out of there and get out of the way. It will continue to pull you down. I have been in the situation where it started to pull me down, but I was able to get out quickly and get out of the way. It's pulling down a column in the center of the bin, and so if you get away from the center of the bin, you don't have to be as quick around the outside to get out of there.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been in that situation a couple of times where the grain was pulling me down, but I was able to work my way out of it.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
LaMar, so I'm curious, as a farmer and admitting that, you took that risk, what was the turning point for you, and when did safety become a priority?
What causes somebody to do a risk-taking behavior is they become accustomed to it and don't recognize it for the risk that it is. Mm-hmm. Have you been out to something other than a grocery store during this shelter at home thing? What's the risk? And we start to think about the risks that we all take on a daily basis, and some find this shelter at home thing overblown, and some of us find that it's not enough, and we look at others and they're the opposite of us. Why is one of us taking it seriously and the other not? We are all risk takers. It just depends on where we are with our life experiences,
yes,
whether or not we take that particular situation as a risk that can kill us or not, whether it's the COVID-19 or it's grain bin or it's working around baby calf and its mother who might take exception to you being there.
All of your work at this point is dedicated to safety and health.
Absolutely.
What was a turning point for you where you decided that you wanted to dedicate your life to encouraging others?
Beth, do you know how many kids I have?
I do not.
Okay, so I have 16 children. 13 of them were adopted. So as a young family off the farm, I needed money to keep them fed and housed and so forth. And so I had a job as a paramedic, and then that evolved into a paramedic and a flight paramedic for 25 years part-time while I was working full-time at the University of Iowa. I saw firsthand, not so many on the farm, but other situations where people took risks and collapsed on them in one way or another, and saw the devastation that causes. And then as you get older, you start thinking about, well, gosh, what if that was my kid, or what if that was me, or what if that was my best friend that happened to? And so you start thinking about all of the ways and what you can do to slow that down or to make people more aware. And it was more of a long-term thing. I am not a safe worker. I freely admit that, and I tell farmers that, and I don't care. Really, and I've told Beth this at least, I don't care if a farmer works unsafely himself. That's his business. But if he's working with workers and his kids or other family members on a daily basis and doing things unsafely, then he's teaching them how to be unsafe. And I find that unacceptable.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really good point about, safety and health in general. A lot of it revolves around your like you said, your personal experience and ultimately behavior change. You can know all the facts and know all the right things to do, but it comes down to how we behave and what we do.
Right.
And so that being said, I know you train responders in terms of rescue and recovery missions. I guess training is one of the ways that we try to implement behavior change in people. Could you talk about that a little bit?
So one of the things that we do is, one of the things that I've done is to teach fire departments and rescue squads how to go about saving or recovering somebody who's gone into a grain bin and gotten caught in the grain. And the main reason that I teach that is because it's a pretty technical rescue. It's not like getting somebody out from underneath a rolled over tractor. There, it's a simple task to lift the tractor up a little bit, pull the person out from under, and you're pretty much done with it. Not quite that simple, but that's the basics. With grain bin rescue, a lot of times the person is completely engulfed. You have to isolate them from the surrounding grain and find a way to get the grain away from them in order to make that work. And you want to do that with as few people inside the bin as possible, because those who have survived a complete submersion have talked about how they could feel people walking around and that put pressure on them. So we want to make sure that people are doing that correctly.
Wow.
You can enter a grain bin safely. You can even enter a grain bin safely when people are drawing grain out from it. But there are technical aspects of that have to be followed to make sure that you don't become the next victim. And we teach that at the Institute to rescuers, but we also teach it to farmers and co-op people and that sort of thing, because it's important for them to know what the hazards are specifically and what steps they have to do and what steps OSHA allows them to do in order to do those things safely. Mm-hmm. And it is safe to do that if you follow the steps correctly.
LaMar, can you briefly cover those steps?
One of the things that we tell people to look for before they enter a grain bin is to, assuming that you're going in through the top, that there's enough grain in the bin to block the lower hatch so that you can't just walk in from the ground level. So as we get up to the top, we open the access opening in the top of the grain bin, and the very first thing I tell them is to smell it. If they're smelling musty grain or a smell that is kind of sour, then there is grain in there that is spoiled or out of condition. That means that there is a potential, a pretty good potential, that there could be grain that's stored in there that has become a problem or is soon to become a problem. The second thing that I tell them to do is to look at the condition of the grain. If it looks good and bright yet, like the day it was put in, and let's keep in mind that if the grain is put in at the wrong moisture level, it can only take a couple of days for it to be spoiled in there and cause problems if it's harvest time of the year. And so it doesn't necessarily take a very long time for that to occur. They're looking for the color and whether it's free-flowing. They're also looking at the angle that it's resting at. It's called the angle of repose, R-E-P-O-S-E. And that angle needs to be consistent with what that grain would normally be at. With corn, most people who get caught in grain are caught in corn, not the others. There's some in those, but most of it's corn. The angle of repose in corn is from 23 to about 27 degrees. So that angle needs to be that correct angle or there's a problem. So if we were to go to the beach and we were to pick up dry sand and we dumped it in a pile and tried to make a castle out of it, we couldn't make a castle. If it is wet, or if the corn is wet, we can all of a sudden create a castle or a cliff in the grain bin out of that grain because it's not dry. And so we're looking for that angle. If the angle is correct if we're not pulling any grain out and we have locked out the auger, if we have been checking that grain on a daily basis and everything has been the same every day, if everything is good at that point, we can turn on the aeration fan for 15 or 20 minutes to make sure that the atmosphere has changed in there, and then it is allowable to go into that grain bin without any other safety things in place. Now, if any of that is different, and we can still use the aeration fans to clear the atmosphere, we would then have to go in if the angle of repose is bad, or if it smells bad, or any of those other situations exist. Then we need to go in with a lifeline on and a full body harness, preferably that would go up to a pulley at the top of the bin, come over to the side where our attendant is minding the end of that lifeline to make sure that we can't be caught in the grain. They can't just hang on to it. They have to have some kind of device, a belay device or some other thing to manage that rope, and they play out a little bit of rope as the person going into the grain bin goes further in to make sure that if a cavity opens up underneath them, that they don't fall down into it.
That's great information. Thank you so much. Is there anything else either of you would like to add?
The main thing that we teach people is to harvest their grain in good condition, store it in good condition, and then they won't have a need to go into the grain bin because it's going to stay in pretty good condition. Then, if they do have to go into the grain bin, lock out all the equipment before you go in so that nobody else comes along, because there have been situations where person A goes in, person B comes along, doesn't know that A is in there, and turns on the equipment. And so lock it out so that nobody can turn it on inadvertently. Mm-hmm. And if everybody followed those rules, we'd be down to probably just 1 or 2 or 3 people a year dying in grain bins.
Right.
LaMar, we really appreciate you being here today and talking about your experience with grain bins and how others can work more safely while they are working in and around grain bins. We hope everyone listening today will go to the website and participate in the upcoming grain stand-up.
Well, thank you so much, Beth and LaMar, and thanks for tuning in, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in, y'all. Remember, your safety is our priority.